and then we'll follow that with any questions that the commissioners may have. Again, commissioners, try to hold your questions until we have question time, and the floor is yours. Mr. Lott.
Sounds good. I'm trying to go through some of these slides. I'm going to move through fairly quickly. We can skip that part because we're going to end up going through it. So, in the midst of the protests over the deaths of various black individuals and the riots of last summer, a group of us got together. Some of us former Harvard alumni, et cetera, and formed an SABA to say, rather than just rely on protest, let's look at data, and from the data, try to make changes in different areas. Just like the unemployment rate is different no matter where you are in the country, issues that cause what we call black poverty clusters are different from region to region, okay? Poverty varies from region to region, and poverty varies among different groups. So that's pretty much it. Right now we have about 10,000 members in the organization itself. That's nationwide. We have reached to about 120,000 people, all colors, et cetera, et cetera. We have been putting out and offering supplemental programs primarily in Pennsylvania and Maryland. We're going to start next summer here in Virginia. And some of the programs are specific, all of the programs are specifically targeted towards underperforming students. But we'll get back to that. So, the issue that I'd like to talk about today with regards to kind of the reason why I'm here has to do with the data related to disparities in education, okay? Just to give you my background, this is a subject that's near and dear to me. Before I was 13 years old, I actually went to 13 different elementary schools. My father was a civil rights minister whose primary responsibility was taking bad churches in the Midwest and the South and working with them to reform them and bring them up to date from all different kinds of situations. I've seen, my family has been homeless when I was a child due to various factors, none our own. My father was abducted and held for 30 days and beaten because of his beliefs. I myself, at 6 years old, a group of kids befriended me and said, there's a shortcut through the white projects. And then they proceeded to try to murder me by beating me with cinder blocks and breaking my left arm. An event that did not prompt the police being called. My dad fixed at the kitchen table. I forgot all about it until I was going in the military. And they told me I was lying on my medical report. And I said, what do you mean? They said, you broke your arm. And then it dawned on me, I was 6 years old. It never occurred to me to even bring it up. And that's what the times were. I have a scar on my left shoulder blade where I was jumped and knifed and left for dead. So I know what racial discrimination looks like. I know what it means to go to bad schools. Norwood Elementary School in Birmingham, Alabama is a school that was decertified. This was a school that I went to, and I told my dad that I don't think that they're trying to teach me anything because I intentionally got 8 out of 10 problems on a test wrong, the test by teacher, and she still gave me an A. She was grading on behavior. So I just put that out there to let you know. Every 7th year I've taken a sabbatical, and I've worked in some of the worst school systems in the country. I've worked in Gary, Indiana, Roxbury, Mattapan, South Chicago, et cetera, all with the goal of trying to work with underperforming black students and trying to figure out what it is that can help them. Why were they underperforming, right? I'm a kid that came from a poor neighborhood, a poor situation. My mom only had an 8th grade education, but I ended up at Harvard. And so from my perspective, I wanted to understand and reach back and try to figure out how things went. So the thing that troubles me that's going on today is one of the major messages that's being given to children is that there is a systemic racism in American society that is holding them back. And what bothers me is this is the primary message that the gangs use in all of the places that I've been to get young black men not to focus in school. Because the story is that since the system is against you, white tribe. So many of the things that I hear in terms of equity, education, et cetera, these things are not new. I got Black history education in Norwood. I had it in the South, and every Southern school I went to had it. We learned about the Civil Rights Movement, we learned about slavery, we watched all the videos. And yet, in the situation that I was in, it did not increase anyone's academic performance. It increased people's anger at the system. Things that we try don't always have the effects that we think that should be. So let's look at the numbers. Let's answer the questions. And I'm not saying these to say that we should have some cultural sensitivity in our training. I think that a certain level of cultural sensitivity in academics and education is simply truth. That we're presenting a non-cleansed history to the kids that show both sides of the story. And I believe that firmly. However, I don't believe that there should be an underpinning that American society is somehow working against these kids. And I'm looking at two levels, actually three levels. National, Virginia, overall, in terms of academics, and then I pulled all the numbers for Prince William County from 2008 until current. So, U.S. Census, 1959. I'm going to try to keep up with this so we started tracking poverty rates in 1959, and I assert that the purpose of education is to deliver children who are able to become adults who are financially independent and educated enough to participate in American society without having to deal with the burden of poverty. Okay? So in 1959, they started to track poverty by race. Okay? And we know from history that the economic starting point of Black Americans was 100%, mostly. And let's go through the numbers, right? Roughly 3% of Americans were not poor at the end of the Civil War, but if you go to the total numbers, it's about 97%. You look at the total GDP, or rather the net worth, and you average it all out, it's pretty much 100%, but I'll say 97%. We know that in the South, at the end of the Civil War, 90% of blacks lived in the South. We also know that the literacy rate in 1865, where the average Black American, that the literacy rate was below kindergarten level in 1865, that by 1968, or by the 1950s, the average education level, formal education level, was about the 6th grade, okay? So these poverty figures show from a national perspective. Blacks at 55% in 1968, drops about 20.7% by 1968, so that's like a 20% drop in 9 years. And then from 1968 to 2018, a 50-year period, you had another drop, down to about another 14%. Okay? White poverty was 18.8% in 1959, fell to 10% in 1968. This is 8.1, but they've adjusted the number. White poverty was 10.1 in 2018. They adjusted those numbers downward this year. So for 50 years, white poverty remained the same, which means that if you were a black person born in the United States, you're more likely to escape poverty than a white child. Because white poverty is flat. But black poverty, from 1959 until 2018, has shown a 3.5 times progress over white Americans. You cannot say that this country is systemically racist. What you can say is that this country, despite all of its flaws and faults, has been correcting the evils of slavery and Jim Crow. Because in 100 years, we went from 100% poverty to 60% out of poverty, right? So that 34.7%, that means that the rest of those people were no longer poor. Now, in the last 2 years, for 2018, 2019, the poverty rates fell in both racial groups by 5.2%, exactly the same. This, to me, does not show numbers of a racist America. This shows numbers of in America that's working it out. So, if we follow the logic, if whites have privilege and the whites have advantage, and that advantage is created by a system to give them that advantage, if the numbers tell us that the ultimate measure, your ability to leave school and get a job and take care of yourself, is advantaging black Americans over white Americans, we cannot assert there is white privilege, and we cannot assert systemic racism. And I dug through these numbers because I was challenged in a subcommittee meeting, and I doubled down and rechecked my numbers. These are raw numbers from the census. So this graph is actually from the Census Bureau website that shows that every racial group has shown improvement over the last 60 years, except white Americans have been limited. It's been restricted. For 50 years, it was about 10%. It didn't move anywhere. It moved up and down around 10%, but it stayed there. It's had a recent drop, along with Asians, who have finally, for the first time in history, matched the white poverty rate at 7.3%. Okay? But everyone else has come down. Blacks, another 2%. Latinos, another 3% or so. Okay? So that's the piece. We're looking at a national level. Where do we stand? What's going on there? So let's flip down and let's look at, we're going to go through the state level. These are statistics from Virginia. These are from the VOE site. Didn't make them up. These are, you can go on the site and you can pull them over yourself. There are 118 school districts that have black students, so not all of them have black students. Okay? Of 118 students, 94 of those have blacks graduate over 90%, at 90%. So 80%, they graduate 90%. 47 of those schools, and 47 of those schools, or 40% of the schools in Virginia, blacks graduate at a higher rate than whites. In 77 school districts, the white-black graduation gap is 5% or less. So the gaps are pretty close. It's pretty close for more than half of it. There are 8 Virginia schools with a double-digit graduation rate difference. And in 4 of those 8, blacks graduate at a double-digit rate above whites. So it's not perfect, it's not parity, but I would count that as progress. Okay? Of the 5 largest school districts in Virginia, the graduation rates, only Virginia Beach has a graduation rate above 3%, and this is the gap, the difference between black and white. Okay? Now there are 2 different graduates you can look at. You can look at the graduation rate and the completion rate. The graduation rate is just 4 year on time. The completion rate includes like GEDs and other completion rates. So Virginia Beach, in Virginia right now is tracking to show the greatest amount of progress in terms of closing the gap. But Prince Williams, 2.3%, Loudon, 2%, and these are 2018 figures from their websites, okay? Fairfax, 2.7%, Chesterfield County, 2.1%. By definition, this cannot be called a disparity, because a disparity must be obvious and significant. This is insignificant. This actually falls within the areas of what we call statistical variation. Well, it says disparities defined as noticeable and usually significant difference or dissimilarity. So we can't technically call these graduations. Now we've also done studies, and the NSBA, we've started studies looking at data across all 50 states, and we were surprised by the data that we saw. And what we found was this: in every major city except for Washington, D.C., where blacks do poorly, whites do worse, by at least half a percentage point or more. D.C. was the only city that had a huge disparity between black and whites. And when we looked at the zip codes of the performance, it's because of how segregated D.C. is. You go to Anacostia, you have blacks in one area, you have wealthier whites and the politicians of the other area, you get a 34-35% disparity. But in Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, Baltimore, whites and blacks, where the schools were bad, they both did poorly. Example, Baltimore. Blacks graduating 72% when whites are graduating at 72%. Okay? Similar in Philadelphia, similar in Pittsburgh. We went through the numbers, and we covered those numbers, and we tried to push those out. About 5 minutes, so I'm gonna run, okay? What's not on this version of it, because I don't see it here, is we also pulled out the numbers for Prince William County. In Prince William County, let me do this. The numbers in Prince William, just to let you know, is Prince William in 2018, the black graduation rate was 82%, or 82.5%, white was about 88%. And without you being able to see the numbers, and I have shared a version of this, from 2008 until 2021. Now, we adjust out for 2020 and 2021 because there's a COVID impact. But if we look at that entire path, the black graduation rate improved by 11.62%. The white graduation rate improved by 9.2%, which means that the black graduation rate improved over whites at a rate of 2.4%. Prince William County is doing something right in correcting inequities. And it's been a trend that's been going on since before. I'm sure before 2008, but these numbers are from VOE, and these are the numbers that the VOE provides. When we go, those are graduation rates, completion rates. Same thing, we see 10.5% for blacks, improvement. We see 6.3% for whites, 4.12% advantage to black students, and overall improvement of performance. And the dropout rate, in some dropout rates, for example, you had some odd years, but in 2050, the dropout rate for blacks and whites was in less than 0.5% difference. In those other years, you started out where the difference was at 4%. Right now, it looks like it's about 2%, but you've had years where it's been below 2%. About 4 years where Prince William's had a differential below 2%. So what's the point of all of this? The point of all of this is that Prince William County has successfully, through focusing on academic rigor and not anything really cultural or racial, and improving the outcomes for kids, the ultimate outcome. The ultimate outcome is being able to take care of themselves after graduation. And so what I'm asking is, when we go forward and we look at culturally sensitive teaching in the classroom, etc., we consider the amount of time. How much time does it take away from the actual academic subject? Does learning an enhanced level of cultural sensitivity help them after graduation? I'm going to tell you no. Statistically, you remember about 15% of what you learn in school. 15%, the rest you're not going to learn. But you will use your academic skills on an ongoing basis. Okay? Academic rigor tends to produce better results than other methods. And academic rigor applied across black, white, Asian, no matter what it is, produces better academic results. And I am just here to say, be cautious. You're going to go forward and you can give recommendations about what it means, what you can do, what the school district can do to affect outcomes. The job here is not to make people feel better about themselves. If that doesn't lead to a better outcome, that's a parent's job. I will tell you, my parents, I learned history from my parents. My father made sure that we sat down and we watched this movie or that movie or this documentary or that documentary. It wasn't the burden of the school to do that. It's the burden of the parent to do that. And when the parent doesn't do something, it does not then become the burden of the school to do it. Your school system is one of the best in the country. And you've been eliminating the gap over decades without any of this. That's something to be celebrated. That's something to say, let's look at what's been working and not shift directions, but do more of that. What I do see is this. In the school systems where we have looked at statistical margins as fine as what you people have put in place, the difference in that 95 to 100 or 95 to 99% improvement had to do primarily with the introduction of individualized learning selectively for children who had reached the ceiling, right? It's exceptions management. If 95% of your kids perform well in the system that it is, it's a lot easier and a lot less expensive to focus on individualized learning for that 8 to 5% that can go to the next level. But you're doing extremely well. And that's really what I came here to say. In terms of, I appreciated the previous speaker in terms of cultural sensitivity, but there's so many things that I disagreed with. He didn't define justice. To me, justice is being able to get a job and take care of you and your family. It creates financial stability for your community. And that's something I can measure. It's not something I feel, it's something that I can measure. And that's what we have to get to. What can you measure? If you can't measure it, you should not be teaching it. And I'll end with this. In the words of Solomon, there is nothing new under the sun. In Alabama, they doubled down and focused on black history as a way to change things. And it didn't do anything. In Mississippi, my mother was born on the same plantation that my family were slaves on. She left when she was 17. Only to find out that the woman who ran the plantation was her great aunt, and it was kept from the young black kids so they wouldn't spread it around town and there would be no backlash. I spent many a summer on that farm. My grandfather was what they say puckwooder, it's a pulpwooder, but puckwooder. If you get messed up in my family, you spent the summers cutting down trees with my grandfather. And there was a lot of racism there. But I encourage you to distinguish between racism and racial discrimination. You cannot change how people feel about each other. And I'll give you examples of massive failures in the public school system. The metric system. We still talk in feet and inches. Bilingual education. The biggest joke they always said when I went to Europe was, what do you call someone that spoke 2 languages? Bilingual. What do you call someone who spoke 1 language? American. Certain things just don't catch on the way we want them to catch on. We've tried these initiatives before. They don't work. And the reason why is that most people are too lazy or not that focused on it. When they go out and they get into real life, 2 languages aren't useful in real life, so that's why we didn't do it. In real life, feet and inches is what we use. That's why I never caught up. Our road signs weren't changed where we needed to do it. It's not going to catch on. And if we then teach our children that their performance in school needs to be dependent on how much they feel their teachers identify with them, they will be miserable failures in life because no boss will ever do that for them again. So part of what we have to teach is be confident in yourself. You don't need others to create confidence for you. And that you can be responsible for educating yourself. Look at history. What, the first 15 founding presidents didn't go to graduate from high school? Which means that education is a process that exists outside of school. Why don't we teach them that? Why don't we teach them that teach them to be rigorous readers, fierce self-learners, so that they can get the education. They can pick up black poetry. They can read books. I never learned about Frederick Douglass and what he did in school. I read a book. I picked up a book because that is what was significant to me. And that's what came from my parents. When the hand of government tries to make these kinds of changes, you create backlash. Because whether you think you are or not, you are selectively addressing one group over another. Whether you think you are or not, children will see it as focusing on someone else over them. In SABA, in the last year, in our Maryland chapter, I have 3 parents whose white sons committed suicide. Because of this emphasis, this focus, this demonization. And I think that, so that's what I'm leaving. We have to be careful. We have to think about it. We have to look at the data. You're doing well, keep doing well. And don't throw something in the muddy of the system. You can look at honesty in history, right? I'll tell you right now, I can tell you for a fact that most history is written at like a 5th grade level. I don't know who wrote these books, but Mary Meyer, who's a professor at MIT, and I studied under her at Harvard, went through, she publishes a group of wonderful books. She recently died, where she actually looked at the ratification of the Constitution.
I'm so sorry, Mr. Lott.
Nope. And I'm
We don't have time, sorry.
No problem.
It went to 25 minutes for the presentation, but we do have questions. So
Sure.
the presentation will continue. I'm sure there are questions on, everyone's minds perhaps,
Go for it.
or not. But just a reminder to everyone to let's try to do this round robin so that everyone has a chance to ask their questions if they have them. And we will do, let's keep it to 2 questions per person, and limit our time to be mindful of everyone else. And let's go ahead and get started with questions if we have any. Commissioner Haddow.
Mr. Lott, thank you for your presentation, and I was delighted to have heard a version of it in our Education Committee meeting. Is it your sense that in Prince William County that we have such a pervasive systemic racism issue in the schools that this culturally responsible teaching is a critical element that has to be overlaid on top of it in order to correct that systemic racism?
I'm not going to get to the data here, but what the primary issue that faces the Black community and Latino community is not that we have a system that currently is discriminatory, but we didn't start from the same place as others did. So, and we have some built-in challenges that are really hard to deal with. And I'll give you an example of one. A first-generation college graduate makes less money than a second or third-generation college graduate. And that's because that first generation doesn't know how to work in the system. It's kind of like you have a superhighway that works just fine, but the on-ramps are inconsistent. And I think it's the on-ramps that are our problem. That's just one example. The other example is parenting, early child, pre-K, universal pre-K, we thought it was going to solve everything. But NIH published a study saying that the effects of pre-K wear off by the 3rd grade. Okay, we have other studies that show that rigor, either training parents on what to do in early childhood development, actually had a longer, better effect in the long-term academic outcomes, and that reading rigor corrected for some of these differences, right? Black Americans and Latino Americans suffer from historically low vocabulary and stimulus in early childhood development. And it affects how we perform long term. We used to believe that you learn new brain connections as you learn things. It turns out that's not true. You're born with too many, and you're pruning as you're going through the education process. And the less rigorous the education process, the more brain connections your brain throws away. So upper middle class people living in a highly stimulated environment, they're retaining more connections and giving them a significant advantage over those who didn't come from that. And it greatly affects poor Black and poor Latinos, even when they move into school systems that are better.
Thank you. School Board Member Williams.
Thank you, Vice Chair Aguilar.